Thanks very much, Don. Earlier, Ian McIver said to me that he likes a good chart and he's looking forward to some graphs, so I stuck another 20 or 30 in, Ian, just to make sure that you get a good sleep in. Righto, so I'll hook through this pretty quick. I've been asked to talk today about protein dynamic changes in Indonesia and China, and there's plenty of experts in this room on that, so if I get any of it wrong, don't be afraid to sing out. I think the thing that puts so much of Asia in perspective is that there's more people living in this circle than outside of it. This is a bit of an old chart you've seen plenty of times before, but it really puts in perspective about where the growth in demand for food is and where the region in the world is that's going to struggle to produce food because there is so many people living in this region. We break this pie down and really break it out into the various countries. Certainly China and India, the two countries with over 1 billion in population. It's a pretty big cliff drop off to the 200 million group, and then it falls away. But the big bit here is so many of the developing nations have got big populations and they're in our region. But I think we traditionally look at these markets as countries, but some of these countries are so big, they're a collection of multiple countries. And as we look at China or Indonesia, India, often we talk about the country of China. We think about it quite as a very big standard country. They're a collection of countries. The states and the cities in some of these countries are bigger than other countries that are actually in the top 30 countries in the world. But another way to look at the world is look at the world in terms of social media groupings and who are the biggest groups of social media and rank that next to countries. So in the top 12, only 2 are countries. The rest of them are social media organisations. There is more people use Facebook and there is more people use YouTube than live in any other country in the world. In the top 18 countries, in the top 18, only 4 are countries. There is more people use Skype in the world than live in Indonesia. Does anyone know what Q-Zone is? Anyone know what Q-Zone is? We're on the cutting edge of social media technology in this room. There is 638 million people use this platform. So when we start looking at how do we interact with customers and how do we interact with consumers, it's bigger than looking at it at countries. And this is, I think, as we start to look at how we engage around protein consumption and how we get more people to eat our product, we need to look at this as a form. I'm not going to go through all the micro details here. There's 142% usage of mobile phones in Indonesia. So the adult population on average has 2 phone accounts in Indonesia. There's not many home phones. If you look at social media, that's over 50% of the population of China is an active social media user on a mobile device. So if we start thinking about protein marketing, it's definitely through mobile device and through social media. Looking at GDP, today it's 2014 data is a little bit out of date, but China's the biggest. It'll be the biggest in 2030 and be the biggest in 2050. Indonesia go from number 9 up to number 4 and up to number 3. It was quite interesting hearing Thomas Lembong speak recently from Indonesia, and he said, if our country does absolutely nothing apart from just keep doing what we're doing and every country gets bigger, we'll still be in the G20. And if you look at our main customers in the world, in our live export world, Indonesia has got huge potential for growth. In 2011, most of us were really caught in the live export issue with Indonesia, but the other thing that happened in 2011 was world population got bigger than arable land. So we now have more people than we have arable land. Arable land is declining, world population is growing. So if you look at the changes in protein trend, the protein trend is the investment in land. And Jennifer spoke about this before, the amount of capital that is going into land, whether it's into direct protein or into other starches that then go into the feeding of livestock is substantial. So the world population expected to go close to 10 billion people by 2050. A lot of investors are looking at land. We break this down a little bit further and look at Indonesia. By 2050, 71% of Indonesia's population is expected to live in urban areas. as we look at how we transact with Indonesia, how our businesses operate in Indonesia, this really starts to impact how we think about cold storage, how we think about distribution, how we think about trucking cattle off ships, how we think about competing against box beef or working with it. The other thing that has a big impact is the change in voting power. So in Indonesia, you know, if you've got the Ag Minister and his votes under your wing and you've got a few other ministers and their votes, you pretty well can make it through and get pretty close to winning an election. As the more population moves into the cities, we've got less voting farmers. The voting farmer bloc is losing its power, and we're seeing that with Indian buffalo at the moment in Indonesia. The farmers that used to have such powerful votes are really losing that impact in Indonesia, and we've got to work out how we work around that and engage with that. We're also getting more and more people in leadership positions, not just in Indonesia, but throughout the world, that don't understand farming, they don't understand agribusiness, they don't understand the farming supply chain, and that's a big challenge for all of us in our industries, but it's also an opportunity if we're proactive and help policymakers and leaders understand that. So 2011 was another big impact in China, where we saw the urban population and the rural population cross over, and you know, very similar issues there with logistics and voting and feeding people that are predominantly city-based, but also understanding where your food comes from. You know, the next slide here is certainly one of Sam's and the LiveCorp team's slide. We've tried to simplify the red meat industry and the supply chain industry to help explain what the red meat industry does into Indonesia. It's really complex, and it goes back to that thing before of less and less leadership, particularly in Southeast Asia as we move forward, understanding the food chain and the food supply chain. And we've seen that in Indonesia with policy positions like 5-to-1, 350 kilo, taxes, and also, you know, various policies. So being active in policy formulation around protein is going to be really important. You know, all of us have certainly experienced the call from importers saying, you know, we need some cattle up here in a couple of days' time. The market's really spiked. Can you get me some cattle up here because I need some more meat? And the opposite of that, can you just slow them down a little bit? I don't need them for a couple of months. And those, you know, the 120-day cycle in Indonesia is certainly a challenge for us. You're looking at emerging markets at rising incomes. You know, the exciting thing for me is China, Indonesia, the Philippines and Vietnam are predicted to have a faster growing GDP than the rest of the world. So our main target markets that we have good relationships with now, and I know the Philippines is a bit challenged, but our main markets of, you know, certainly China, Indonesia and Vietnam are predicted to have good growth. That growth over time has continued to grow from a predominantly plant-based diet to an animal-based diet, and continues to look to grow that way, which is really exciting. So I'm going to rush through some of these to get it done. If we look at lower income versus higher income, as people get more money, history has shown that they spend more on food. So calories per capita per day continues to increase as people get more food, particularly in developing nations, particularly in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India. You know, those countries, as people get more money, they buy more food. The really exciting thing for me is they spend it on beef, and I've just put a couple of countries on there just to show where they sit: the US, Japan, Australia. Japan is a bit of an outlier with its older population, but the markets that we touch of China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia down in that bottom left-hand corner with low GDP per capita also have low beef consumption. The global trend for them to increase consumption is huge, and certainly outstripping OECD growth. You know, those three countries look pretty exciting. Indonesia, certainly Greg touched on a lot of Indonesia before, and the strength that Jokowi's had from a wobbly start. Certainly got into tax reform. Indonesia last year was in the region took more foreign direct investment than any other country in Indonesia. It's quite easy to get foreign capital into Indonesia. It's quite easy to set up a business. Running it can be a challenge, but we've certainly seen political challenges there. There's certainly an inwardly looking view on food security, and there's going to be some challenges around that. You know, Jokowi's prediction that by 2020 he'll have inflation back up to 7% is pretty bold, but even if it sits at 5%, it's a much more healthier place to invest than Europe, much more healthier place to invest than North America and a lot of other countries around the world. Probably the thing that this doesn't show is what we're seeing at the moment is a softening of consumer confidence with some of the instability, with some of the changes around tax, some of the changes around customs regulations, that the average consumer just leaving a little bit more money in their pocket. We're seeing some big department stores in Indonesia announce they're going to close, partly due to online retailing and the distribution cheaply by motorbikes of products from online, and we've got to think about that as we how we target our beef production. The rupiah is a big challenge in Indonesia. It's weakening, which is great for food exports, not too good for imports, and with Indonesia focusing on trying to be a self-sufficient country for food and not export too much food. When your currency is cheap, you've got to have regulation to slow exports down. Otherwise, they'll naturally happen, and we're seeing that. I'll skip over that. Here, some work that Deloitte did just in terms of what drives spending decisions, and I appreciate there's a lot of detail in here. For those that don't know, about 93% of beef in Indonesia goes through small wet markets, retail outlets, and of beef that's sold through retail. The traffic in Indonesia is bloody difficult. There's a big push to use local markets from the government and then continue to improve local markets. And more small local markets selling fresh food is certainly helpful for our industry, but don't underestimate the investment that's going into cold chain logistics. Much of the food in meat dishes selling at $2 to $3 per meal. The cut is of less of importance, the price is quite important, and we've got to be careful we don't overcomplicate the beef carcass in Indonesia through sort of thinking at it through Western eyes. Look at the dishes, look at the national foods, and make sure that we're helping to invest in capacity around that. Now, the bottom is quite busy. There's a couple of key takeaways from this: that price isn't that important as you spread through income. Taste is quite important. Taste is a little bit more important for lower income people. Innovation is more important for higher income people. Pretty straight, normal things. But local cattle are worth more. There's a trust in local cattle. There's a trust in local beef. This is another busy chart, but basically if you look out to 2050, for all major food types apart from palm oil, Indonesia is going to have to grow imports significantly, particularly in things like fruit and beef and even sugar. One of the opportunities for Australia with China and Indonesia is the difference in our meat processing costs. So meat processing costs in Australia is more than 10 times higher than Indonesia, 5 times higher than China, 2.5 times the US. Labour costs are much cheaper, innovation's a lot easier, red tape is cheaper, energy's cheaper, and that certainly gives a competitive advantage. The Australian meat processing industry, though, is embracing technology, but I think we'll see those foreign markets embrace that technology just as fast once they work it out. Often get asked the question about Australian cattle, Indonesian cattle, what's an Indonesian breeder worth, and how do we get an Australian breeder into Indonesia, and is it cheaper for them to import cattle from Australia or breed their own? Breeding heifers from Australia land in Indonesia, when this were put together, were cheaper per kilo, more expensive from Brazil and very expensive from the US. Brazil and the US will never, ever, ever get closer to Asia. Their cost to get there is going to be expensive, and we've got to take advantage of that. Just moving on to China. Chinese consumption continues to grow. Getting anyone who's tried to get Chinese cattle herd numbers is, it's really challenging. It's quite difficult to know what they are, how heavy they are, and what actually are cattle in the inventory of beef and yaks and dairy. But overall, the Chinese herd is declining dramatically, and that's we've seen that through the pull-through from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, and as far south as Malaysia at times. And their appetite for beef continues to grow. But again, China's just not one market. It's not a steak market, or it's not a hot pot market across the whole country. It's a very diverse market. Different regions, different states, all have different meat types. And I think we often look through Australian eyes of we either have mince or we have steak, and we keep it pretty simple in Australia. In these countries, it's quite complicated. So the next slide is a bit of an attempt to show one of the things that I think personally will be a challenge in China. So if we look here, we've got Sam. This is Sam in China. So Sam gets a wife. And I know there was the gay marriage issue today, and I'm not going to go into that. And this is a little bit controversial because Sam's the only one that earns money. So Sam gets a wife. They have one child. The one child finds a partner. Sam then inherits the family of the partner, and their son, Sam number 2, becomes the breadwinner for 2 sets of grandparents and his wife. They think they might have a child, which is a pretty good thing to do. That child finds a partner. We then pick up the next partner. We then pick up the partner's parents, and then we pick up the next child. And we've got one income earner there, potentially. So with people living longer in China, no sort of sophisticated superannuation system, no government-backed superannuation system, I think this could be one of the big challenges for China, is how does a flat or declining population that is getting older, that doesn't have a safety net, cover the cost of itself? I think that's probably the challenge. The opportunity here with, jumping back to just Australia's competitive advantage versus Indonesia and China, to produce 100 kilograms of beef, Agri-Benchmark certainly reports that the NT is quite cheap. It's a little bit cheaper than Australia. It's cheaper than Indonesia, but not that far. Cheaper than China, but overall considerably cheaper than all of Europe and the US and even parts of South America. So the opportunity for us in Southeast Asia is to grow the pie and not fight over slices of it. There's a massive amount of the population that don't eat beef. We've got to work out how we get engaged with that population, how we communicate with them and get them starting to eat beef on a regular basis, and how we I believe, grow the pie that's eating beef rather than have fighting over the slices of pie. So, Don, I'll wrap it up and keep moving. Thank you.